Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we are finally going to be talking about the newest album from the Mountain Goats, called Goths. Before we get into this review, I think there are two things that need to be placed in the proper context. One, my relationship with the whole goth subculture, and two, my relationship with the music of the Mountain Goats. And in both cases, gets kind of complicated in a hurry. See, if you see me rambling on Twitter at some point late at night, I'll typically have wandered into one of my favorite goth club haunts or some music that actually has an edge and a pulse and to really soak in that atmosphere. But whether I personally would call myself a goth, well, people have been arguing about that qualifier for decades now, but I'd probably say it's not really a label that fits me exactly. I mean, I like a lot of gothic music and fashion, and it's very easy for me to feel comfortable in a goth club. You're not going to find a crew as openly accepting of oddballs like myself, despite appearances, as that subculture, along with some markedly more likable music and more diverse music at that. They actually play metal, but for me, there's often a time and a place for it, never quite a scene that I've completely embraced. And here's the funny thing. I get the impression that John Darnielle, the frontman of the Mountain Goats, he might feel something of the same, which leads us to the Mountain Goats. Now, full disclosure, while I might have been initially introduced to them through Nash over at Radio Dead Air, check him out. He broadcasts online live on Monday evenings. His content really is excellent. I've never really done a huge deep dive into the band, and thus I've spent the past 3 or 4 weeks exploring all 15 full-length records in their backlog, from their rough scrabble, lo-fi days in the 90s to the slightly more polished indie folk side in the 2000s to the steps towards more lush indie rock that's come in recent years. And while I would definitely call myself a fan of this group, I wouldn't really say that I'm a big one, mostly tied to a lot of the energy and strength of the melodies, along with Darnielle sticking with more defined stories instead of the more abstract pieces that sometimes can feel a little bit scattered. It's also one of the reasons I have a hard time citing a favorite Mountain Goats record or ranking them in order. I mean, for me, unless they've got a unified thematic arc, I tend to like bits and pieces, assorted songs across a number of albums. Although, if I had covered Beat the Champ back in 2015, it would have had a serious shot to make my year-end list. That record hit so many of the same moments and high notes that made Darren Aronofsky's movie The Wrestler back in 2009 click so deeply for me, it is actually kind of startling. But with their album this year, Goths? Well, of course, the comparisons to the writing of Nick Cave, I was bound to get on board, but I was a little bit concerned that Darnielle had opted to abandon his guitar entirely for this record, which could lead to a very different sound and one that was sure to piss off the die-hard lo-fi Mountain Goats fans at last, probably drive them away for good. But hey, what did we get out of Goths? Well, alright, here's the thing. For a lot of Mountain Goats fans, not just the die-hard lo-fi group, I can predict them not really getting on board with this album. Because if you were skittish about their previous sonic adventures, this record might be too far afield for you. And yet at the same time, if you're going in expecting John Darnielle to make a true goth rock record that's indebted to the sounds and tones of that time, well, you'll get a little bit more of what you want, but not nearly enough for a record that sonically probably has a lot more in common with Dan Behar's recent output as Destroyer than Bauhaus or Sisters of Mercy or Susie and the Banshees or The Cure. Hell, the strongest thematic touch point would probably lie closer to something like 2015's Jane St. Murtry record Complicated Game, and yeah, that's the point. If anything, I'd say that Goths is a stridently unique album. The sort of record where I'm not surprised at all by the confusion in its reception by so many folks, fans and otherwise, especially among critics. And for me, it just resonated on a level that very few albums have even approached this year. I think a big part of this review will be explaining how it hit that point for me and why in my books, this is easily one of the best albums I've heard thus far in 2017. It's gonna make a year-end list. Because here's the thing, from the opening track Rain in Soho, I can see how it would confirm expectations in the best and worst way possible going in. Darnielle is dipping back into his lower register, getting a little bit more hoarse and nasal. The drums and the bass thrum beneath the main piano line. A choir reminiscent of Sisters of Mercy swells amidst the haunted lyrics, which pulls up the tattered fragments of horror kitsch pagan iconography and seething melodrama to something that's far more striking. It'll likely go down as one of the Mountain Goats' most potent tracks. It's already surging up to be one of my favorites thus far in 2017. It is that good on its own, and it's a hell of a way to open up an album like this. But just like with Heel Turn 2 a couple years ago, it's a track that ends with an extended outro, this time lingering on somber keys to emphasize that that loneliness, all those gothic trappings and fantasies just seeming to ebb away. And that's when it hits you. John Darnielle, he isn't looking to celebrate goth culture. He's going deeper than that. He's peeling back the swirling style and sound that for so many lingers as a dying artifact just in the underground, and finding the real humanity in the stories beneath it all. And yet, this isn't a subversion or a deconstruction of goth culture. Darnielle is not looking to rip apart the subgenre to dissect it. He's instead looking to consider just every angle, from without and from within, with the self-awareness to see through all the trappings, but the tremendous sense of empathy that's always told a lot of his writing extending even here. And that's one of the reasons that, believe it or not, I actually think that the production on this record and a lot of the choices here, they actually are kind of ingenious. The muted keys and the synths that can seem slightly off-kilter in some of the melodies beneath the margins, the firm bass lines and the sharper drums, the swells of horns. It doesn't quite so much sound like gothic intensity as something that's smaller, almost normal soft rock, less angry disaffection or contempt for the world around you, but more attempt to emphasize some quiet tensions and old memories. I mean, sure, Shelved, it cranks up some of the darker bass grooves against the muted keys and the fuzzy synths, but that's a song entirely about an internal crisis for this goth artist, the tension that needs to be there. But otherwise, take a song like Unicorn Tolerance, with all the twinkling keys against the wiry low tones, it's got the feel of struggling to project a veneer to mask insecurities at not being yourself, or take the mournful sax lines on Rage of Travers, or Abandoned Flesh, reflecting all those faded glories. Outside of Moments, it's not a visceral album, it's not a thrilling album, and in capturing not so much the ideal as the reality of a goth, that's kind of the point. And yet, I can't stress how powerful and essential Darnielle's empathy is when telling a lot of these stories. Because not only are you examining a frequently misunderstood and frequently ostracized subculture, but one where its time in the spotlight that's plainly passed on, at least from its obvious heydays. It doesn't shy away from the theatricality that's often emphasized and perpetuated some of the alienation, even among some would-be allies. I mean, take a look at Rage of Travers, where an old 70s rocker, he finds his career just evaporating in the face of goth rock in California, where even among the alienated, he doesn't quite belong. That sometimes happens. But Darnielle, he also highlights how such subcultures can enable dangerous or extreme or self-destructive people, especially on songs like The Grey King and The Silver Flame Attunement, where the central character, he's desperate or crazy or mad enough to go on one last ride, where our narrator, he might be pretty hardcore against that dreary bass thrums and the mournful horns, but he's not that hardcore at this point. Or take the wonderfully named Unicorn Tolerance again, where Darnielle, he doesn't shy away from highlighting how those adolescent gravitation towards the whole coolness of goth at that time, while neglecting the brighter fantasy novels that he used to love as a kid, which, yeah, it's got a sad sort of irony given these days, given that he would never have to do that. Hell, even then, given how much goth culture has embraced paganism and fantasy, it's an easy crossover. Or take Wear Black, which shows both the veneer of dispassionate cool while highlighting how often it is just a veneer, especially when confronted with the real-life consequences of those who are really trying to live that life, with the specter of hard drugs lingering pretty consistently across this album. But those themes of age and the passage of time from goth's heyday, they do wear heavy on this record. What was subtext on Kyle Craft's Dolls of Highland is very much text on Goths, and one thing that Darnielle's writing captures so damn vividly is that sense of place and time, especially against the backdrop of an indifferent society around them that has less the subculture to lurk in its lairs. And as such, you get all these old bars with men in Motorhead jackets and rusted out old fog machines that won't even get stolen, where an icon of the scene can come back for a crowd on Andrew Eldritch's Moving Back to Leeds. But you know what? He rides among everybody else, a relatively nondescript homecoming. There's a hard-scrabbled DIY aesthetic blurred with pretensions to opulence, the lingering rumors of what's left on various scattershot local scenes on We Do It Different on the West Coast. And even in the era of the internet, these sorts of word-of-mouth conversations, they still happen, even if the bass melodies and the vocal harmonies aren't normally as subtle or brilliant. And then there are the goth bands. Not just the big ones who are most secure, like The Cure or Susie and the Banshees, but those who are near forgotten. They're just getting by now. The aging rockers who stumble and skid through Stench of the Unburied and just this drug-addled incoherence in the blistering heat of Los Angeles, even at that time, all against the gentle tones that don't sound that far removed from the sanitized soft rock that represents everything nothing normal around them. Or you have the artist who sees the scene stripped of all of its vitality and shelved to realize that he's still got the option to live a normal life writing code for LucasArts and C++. Again, the irony given how much nerd and video game culture would intersect and then overlap with goth culture, and then years later, after the trends have faded, jobs have been found, and life goes on, with old boots and records tucked into the back of the closet just waiting to be picked up again, the dilapidated theatricality that the horns on paid and cocaine just perfectly capture, because for those who have embraced and understood the sound and the scene, they'll always find a way back. It'll likely be a bit of a grayer scene, the edges a little bit more worn and decayed, the sound's a little bit more dated, but you'll always be welcome back. There's always a place for you there. You know, about 4 years ago, I went on a date with an absolutely beautiful woman, about 10 years my senior. I'll avoid names in case she happens to see this, but we were both writers, we both loved singing karaoke, we both hung around the same goth bars, and I remember a graying September afternoon where she was telling me about how the goth scene in Toronto just wasn't really the same as it was 5 or 10 years ago. The old places, they were closing down. Many folks had packed up to move to Montreal where it was still a little bit more vitality. The old crowd wasn't always there. And it wasn't long before one of my favorite goth places in Kensington Market got bought out and closed down, and I assumed the scene had just finally dissipated around that area. So flash forward to this year, 2017. I decided to check out what had replaced that old goth bar. And while they had added a pool table, couple arcade cabinets, done a little bit of remodeling, clearly trying to rebrand, the crowd hadn't changed. They stuck around. And it was thinking about that woman and those people who I know when I drink and I dance and I sing with, a little less now than I used to, but I always know that I can come back. And even though I didn't grow up in the 80s, I can't claim to have lived that whole story, know that whole history by heart, recognize every single goth band. The moments of rejecting teenage fantasy to aim for popularity, finding a stable job with my combat boots and my heavy leather jacket tucked in the back of my closet, from the melancholy and the aching empathy for the outsider in times long past, to the thrill of knowing that some part of that over-dramatic melodrama will linger. The fact that Josh Darnielle can capture it all with such poise and not hold back with his framing to capture all the angles that are less than flattering, where things don't quite fit the same way they used to, all against production that does buck against convention of what you would expect, but it works so beautifully. Yeah, I love this album. Easily one of the best records of 2017. It's getting a solid 9 out of 10 from me and the highest of my recommendations. And while I know goth rock and Mountain Goats fans might not take to this immediately, I urge you all, really let it sink in. It might not be what you expect, but for some of you, no. For some of us, it's exactly what you needed. Check it out. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. I'd like to like and subscribe. I'd be more than grateful. Yeah, I know I got a little bit personal in this review. I don't normally do that. It's not really something I try to factor in when I evaluate the record, but when it resonates on that level, trying to really decode what it meant, I kind of had to bring it up. It was relevant here. Beyond that, if you guys want to get this record, and I highly recommend you do, links in the description below. And I'm curious where more Mountain Goats fans fall on this, so I got the poll up there. Love to see what you think. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get involved in my scheduling, here's a link to my Patreon right there, where 3 times a week you guys get to vote on my schedule, and once a week you guys get to add records to my schedule. More details right there. And until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.